I'm, at this point, delighted to welcome one of my best friends and colleagues at Governor's State, Reverend Bobby Mills, who would like to give his perspective on appropriate technology to open the evening.
Good evening. Beth wouldn't say that I was the token black, so I'll say it for her. The ecological crisis has some wide-ranging kinds of parameters to it. But the ecological crisis basically is symptomatic of the larger problem of human values and institutional structures and the inability of mankind to integrate ideas. I suppose one can say that the basic cause of the crisis is the idea of human exploitation, that somehow mankind believes that he can exploit his greatest resources, other human beings, and at the same time build human community. Thus, human exploitation is institutionalized in political processes, economic processes, educational processes, and social processes as ways and means of restricting access to valued resources in the society. Unfortunately, ideas rule the universe, but negative ideas have more control than positive ideas. That is, man being negative about himself and developing processes that perpetuate the exploitation of other human beings has brought us to the point of self-annihilation. Therefore, the greatest source of pollution in our society is our mindset. It is the kind of axiology, the kind of logic that we use to develop the theories that govern and undergird values and processes within society. There are two social processes in life. One is life in life, and the other is death in life. Unfortunately, mankind has chosen to build upon death in life rather than life in life. Our technology reflects this, that we are a culture of death, simply because we have not come to understand the meaning of life. Therefore, the ecological crisis does not stem from a lack of knowledge about how we do it. It stems from the idea that man wants to exploit, and therefore it's more of a problem of human values and will than generating more technology. The problems of environmental quality stem from dominant cultural and political economic values that are legitimized and institutionalized in order to perpetuate negative ideas. Seemingly, there are four values that have guided America's affluence. The first value is that of growth. We feel that the more we have, the better off we are, and therefore we have not dealt very responsibly with our environment in terms of controlled growth. Secondly, the notion of consumption. The more things we have, the more things we consume, the greater the progress, the greater the prosperity. The notion of external values versus the notion of internal spiritual values. The notion of technology, thirdly, more technology. That is the idea that science can cure all of our social ills. And then fourthly, the plentiful nature ethic. That is that in some way nature is a free resource that we can continually exploit and not have it bring about diminishing returns. Thus, the idea of human exploitation has not facilitated two important processes that are necessary for the development of human community, either on a local level, a national level, or an international level. The first such notion is that of the integration of ideas. Life is about ideas, and therefore mankind must learn universally to integrate ideas. Unless we integrate ideas, we will never be able to integrate bodies or cultures. Secondly, because we have not been able to integrate ideas, we have not been able to deal with systems integration or systems analysis. And therefore, the kinds of processes that we bring about do not reflect notions about human community. They do not reflect notions about how we do it for ourselves. Therefore, the resolution to the current ecological crisis will require two things. It will require, first of all, that we responsibilitize life, that we responsibilitize self, and in order to responsibilitize self, we must begin to deal with personal liberation as well as institutional liberation. Secondly, some basic changes must occur in terms of our value orientations and the kinds of institutional structures that undergird them. The notion of exploitation and the notion of privilege seemingly undergird everything that we do. And therefore, we are destined to seek to multiply subordinates rather than create systems that multiply equals. We must call off this privilege game and institute the collective responsibility game. We must stop playing death games and start the war for life. For it is the idea of human exploitation that has brought us to the outer limits of our existence, because we've been on the wrong side too long, fighting against ourselves, against nature, and against mankind, and ultimately against God. Unfortunately, much of what I've heard here today is that old middle-class value that I've gotten mine, and therefore somehow we can stop growth. Just about every session I've been in, I've witnessed people talking about no growth. And as a black person, it is very difficult for me to deal with the concept of no growth, simply because there are too many underdeveloped countries that are minority countries in the world that could benefit from technology. And the problem is not technology. The problem is the uses that technology tend to be put to. And therefore, to talk about no growth, is to continually perpetuate the notion of privilege, and therefore not the notion of collective responsibility. We must responsibilitize life. We must become God-like caretakers of the creation and realize that we are the most important things in the creation, not the things that we create. We are more important, and therefore we must value us and life more important than we value our cars, our homes, or the kinds of lifestyles that we live based on materialistic values. We must go back on the inside of us and clean up our minds, and then the lakes and the streams and God's creation will invariably take care of itself, because the right kinds of ideas will guide the institutions and the processes of mankind.
probably one of the most phenomenal pieces of integration of ideas and institutions that has happened at this conference is that the University of Illinois Circle Campus, the University of Illinois Urbana, Governor State University, Northwestern, and the University of Chicago all managed to come together on something. And in particular, at this time, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank a man who took a big gamble, and that's Ed Kolker, who's chairman of the art department here at the University of Illinois Circle Campus. Jim and I approached him some time ago with the opportunity of having Dr. Schumacher in Chicago, and we searched long and wide for a place to have a meeting of the sort that we wanted, and Ed thought that probably one of the most appropriate things that could be done was to have Dr. Schumacher deliver the John E. Wally commemorative lecture on technology. And the more that I've read about John E. Wally, there was an appropriate technologist. He was an artist, helped found the Department of Art and Architecture here, didn't have a degree, which made all the people at Governor State happy. You know, was definitely a self-educated man. Ed told me tonight, just before I came out here, that John probably would have been running around the conference with clipboards and trying to get people to come over to his house. He must have been a remarkable man, and I wish that I could have known him. So we thank Ed Kolker. I'd like to introduce Anthony Maggiori, who is currently chairman of the board of the National Center for Appropriate Technology, and you know that we at Acorn have high hopes for that center, and he will introduce Dr. Schumacher.
I'd like to make this very brief and highlight Dr. Schumacher's background and history, but this is not to be construed as comprehensive at all. But it would seem to me that I think we're all interested in hearing what Dr. Schumacher has to say. Dr. Schumacher was born in 1911 in Bonn, West Germany. He attended Oxford University. He was the first Rhodes Scholar from Germany after World War I. He was a graduate student and junior faculty member at Columbia University. He returned to Germany and worked in banking in Berlin. He then immigrated excuse me, to England in 1937 and worked on banking and business. Shortly thereafter, he was interned briefly as an enemy alien in England and spent several years as a farm worker in Northumberland, England. And that was right after the war, or right prior to the war, excuse me. From 1950 to 70, he was the chief economist for the National Coal Board in England. In 1955, he began to become involved as an economic advisor to developing countries, specifically Burma and India. In 1962, in India, he proposed for the first time the concept of appropriate and intermediate technology. In 1965, Dr. Schumacher founded the Intermediate Technology Development Group in England. And in 1973, as I think most of us know, he wrote the book Small is Beautiful. This summer, summer of '77, another book will be published titled A Guide for the Perplexed by Harper and Row. And shortly thereafter, in fall of '77, a book co-authored with Peter Gillingham titled Good Works will also be published. It is my sincere pleasure to present to you Dr. Schumacher.
I have been informed that you would like me to explain how this trip has come about, this marathon from coast to coast. Well, it has come about simply because so many people and institutions wanted to discuss matters from quite a number of different motives. There were some saying we are very much concerned about the energy problem. Please, can we get together and discuss that? Well, why would they want to discuss it with me? They say because you are working on a different alternative technology, and this should be relevant to the energy problem. Others wrote, please, we are interested in what you're trying to do with alternative technologies. We are mainly concerned that our province or state or part of the country is being denuded of vitality. We don't want to die. We have become a colony of some big conurbation. All the brightest and the best people leave. There are no jobs. We are a colony also in the sense that the only reason why other people are interested in us is to get raw materials. Could we discuss that? This had something to do with technology. Others wrote, we are struggling with the problem of poverty, and we don't seem to be making any headway. The poor are being kept going by welfare payments, but that doesn't solve the problem. That simply, well, keeps them afloat, but how? The problem of poverty doesn't seem to be soluble no matter how great our advances in society as a whole, particularly our technological advances. And somehow the technology recedes further and further from the poor, because the technology requires more and more money to establish anything. And so it went on. Others again talked about ecology. And they said, we are interested in your approach to a smaller scale, a softer technology. Can you come and we'll meet and talk about it? Now, this to me was very interesting because it showed a common denominator. All these various problems, people were beginning to see have something to do with technology. I do not for a moment deny that the technology itself, again, is not a primary phenomenon. It has something to do with the system, and with what we've heard earlier, with the materialist philosophy. But without going back to the metaphysical roots of all the problems, technology seemed to be the common denominator which made people want to discuss. Now, what's happened to technology? I mean, technology is a wonderful thing. Because, no doubt, of a crudely materialistic ideology rampant in the Western world, we have developed the technology as if it was a thing by itself. Not from the point of view of what do people really require, but from the point of view, what can we actually do? And so in many respects, we have developed a stunt technology. Well, the greatest stunt was to land people on the moon. It's not a matter that concerns the poor of this world. I wasn't totally against it. I had myself quite a long list of people. But when I realized I always fetched them back again, I couldn't see any point in it whatsoever. A stunt technology which pursues this as an end in itself. We don't start with an assessment of what we and our fellow beings actually now need. No, we start with some bright idea of what could be done, and because it can be done, so we do it. And in this process, where ambitious young people immediately go to the frontier of technology and push it further, over the years, particularly in the last 30 years, the technology has moved away from real human concern. Yes, to make things shinier, glossier, more mass production, faster, all that, but not what people actually need. If you come to look at every article you find in a shop, from that point of view, you will see this is so. It's for stunt effect. Of course, that has something to do with the marketing. It has something to do with the general aimlessness of our modern society, doing things not because they ought to be done, but because they can be done. And so the technology, I suggest, has assumed, I have picked out 4 features that are particularly damaging to the human concerns that we all share. It's become too big. And when things are too big, small guys, as you call them in this country, little people, are lost. Secondly, it's become too complex, hence a tremendous effort of specialization, creating more and more narrow specialists, who, however, are little gap fillers. They're not highly trained people who, if the worst comes to the worst, can stand on their own feet. No, they are highly dependent that this little specialism should be required by government or a big corporation. Thirdly, it has become immensely expensive. It is quite incredible what capital investment, normally subsidized by the inland revenue, what capital investment is required for doing the slightest thing in this economy. An enormously expensive way of doing things. As a result, you may be doing them very fast and very glossy and very polished, etc. But it means that unless you already are pretty rich or powerful, you can't start production. You can only hawk yourself around and see if you can find a job, but if there aren't enough jobs, that's your lookout. And fourthly, the technology has become quite peculiarly violent. You know, our ancestors, some of whom spoke Latin, they used to talk about medicine in the terms primum non nocere, which means, now first of all, make sure you don't do any harm. But this principle, first of all, make sure you don't do any harm, has been thrown out of the window. We have a very violent technology. We say it doesn't matter. Science will take care of the consequences. I mentioned already this morning, the outstanding example of violence is that we're prepared to litter the world with plutonium, a substance which will be a danger to all life for all time. And don't quibble with me and say it's only for 3 million years. The half-life of plutonium is 24,400 years, which is no longer a historical period. These are geological periods, totally out of human scale. You may have heard that we have today more scientists alive than all previous mankind put together. And you may well ask, what are they all doing? And the answer will come back, they're all solving problems. Now you might get really worried, aren't we running out of problems? But no, don't worry about that. We have them bigger and better. That is due to the fact that we take a violent approach to the solving of problems, like taking a big sledgehammer and cracking the nut so that it flies in all directions. And we have seeded 12 new problems. And then we take 12 sledgehammers. That's called exponential growth. Now, if this is so, too big, too complex, too expensive, and too violent, so then let's look in the opposite direction. Are we really so daft, so incompetent, that we can't find solutions to our problems with rather smaller equipment, simpler equipment, cheaper equipment, deploying a soft technology, a technology that works with nature and doesn't bludgeon her all the time. Now this is the approach of intermediate technology or alternative technology, a new direction of looking. It's not a definition of something in particular, it's a new and different direction of looking to correct the over-exaggerated development of the last 50 or 100 years. Not to throw away any science, but to use science in a more humane way. To my little book, which some of you have seen, I gave the subtitle, Economics as if People Mattered. Economics is being pursued as if the last thing you think about is the people. You think about production. You think about the balance of payments. You think about inflation, but you never think about people. You think by thinking of those technical things, you're thinking of people, but you don't. You say, here we have to rationalize. So many people are thrown out of work. What becomes of them? Oh, well, these are the social consequences. Yes, somebody has to attend to this. That's not the starting point of thinking, but it comes later. Now, one of the most interesting developments in this society, and in some others, goes under the name of technology assessment. Namely, that people have grown wise to the fact that technology is being used, developed, possibly in the wrong directions, and before any great new program or project is launched, they want it assessed. The whole question is, how do you assess it? Now, I would propose that 4 questions should be asked in this assessment. The first 2 relate to humanity. After all, it isn't worth doing anything officially with taxpayers' money or other people's money of any kind unless it is related to the problem of poverty. The rich, in all consciousness, don't require help. It's the poor that require help. We don't have to launch projects so that the rich can become richer. They can, on the whole, quite adequately look after themselves. But we need projects and programs, even technological developments, to fight poverty. So this is the first question that ought to be addressed to any project or program. What is its relevance to poverty? Now, when I say poverty, we think mainly of the body. But the second question is, what is its relevance to the mental and spiritual health of mankind? Because after all, we don't only have a body, we also have something more. And if the technology is of a kind that those who work it, or that its effect is that it drives them or us bonkers, then we don't want it. Then it gets a very, very low rating or negative rating on the second question. What does it do for the spiritual and mental health of humanity? If it involves assembly belt production or any other demeaning, degrading labor or mind-boggling, mind-killing labor, then it gets a negative rating. That's the second question. The third question to be addressed is, what does it do to living nature around us? Now, living nature is very tolerant, but she has been warning us over the last 2 decades, look, you're going too far. I can't take much more. And hence we have the ecological crisis. And the fourth question obviously has to be, it relates to non-living nature around us. What is its relevance to energy, the energy problem, or other problems of non-renewable raw materials? Now, if we address these 4 questions, if they take root in the consciousness of the people at large, and they hammer these questions in a similar way as the question, what does the technology do to the physical health and safety of the worker, has been hammered. After all, it's not the first time that new criteria are developed. If we do that, then we might be able to to enforce the development of a more humanistic and more natural and more soft and altogether more intelligent technology. In all these matters, the dynamic factor of society is what? It is the creation and utilization of new knowledge, And our intelligence, our capacity to create new knowledge is almost the most precious thing we have, and therefore we have to become extremely sensitive to the abuse of this capacity. What is the abuse of this capacity? I will give you an example. I pulled out of a prominent magazine, you find it in many other magazines, an advertisement. You can't see it at the distance. It shows father, mother, and two small children and a dog, absolutely horror-struck. And the heading is, "Why Horror Movies Are More Horrible on the Quintrix 2-Color Picture Tube." This is published by a company who call themselves Panasonic, just slightly ahead of our time. It's really worth anybody's while studying advertisements, because you see what they take you for. The next thing after this terrible picture is a bit of science. An extra pre-focus lens for sharpness, plus an inline tube for brightness and contrast, and then some pseudoscientific drawing, which nobody can understand, but it knocks you over. And then it goes on, blood is bloodier, fangs are sharper, claws are crueler. You will love it. To lead on to the astonished question, how did Panasonic do it? And then you get another dose of science. Well, it's quite funny, but it is the abuse and misuse of the greatest thing that mankind has for our worldly purposes, that is to say our technological intelligence, and of course all the resources that are put behind this. Another example, I picked up a news release from some people who call themselves modestly America's most respected technological market research organization. And this relates to the future of the US baking industry. And they say that it won't do to have lots of little bakeries all over the place. That's uneconomic. The move will have to be towards fewer bakeries with larger facilities and a distribution of what is then sold as bread up to 500 miles from base. If you take the map of the United States, you see that you need only about a dozen bakeries in the whole United States. And here again, this marvelous use of this precious asset, technological intelligence. For instance, they say present packaging machinery running at the rate of 60 loaves per minute fails to gear with lines of producing bread at the rate of 240 loaves per minute. The process therefore becomes highly extravagant in terms of personnel. Well, it's quite intolerable, isn't it? This is how we use technology. And if we now could really establish and root these four questions, then these things could be efficiently attacked. Meanwhile, of course, it is necessary to do constructive work. And this, it seems to me, what I've been able to see from coast to coast, is is quite a cheering picture. Everywhere people are getting together and are beginning really to not just talk and shake their fist, but start working. What we are working for is really a democratic technology so that everybody can participate. And I will close by flying a kite for just one highly democratic technology, which I believe will have to receive ever increasing attention in the very difficult period into which we are moving. And this has to do with trees. Trees on the whole can be called the finest present made by the Creator to this world, the most useful endowment of the world, but the one that mankind has notoriously neglected and misused. Most of the great ecological damage in most parts of the world where it's happened has been due to the misuse of trees and generally deforestation and not bothering about replacement, etc., etc. These trees also have a vast variety of potential, from, of course, wood production to fiber production and fruit production, but also food production. Occasionally, we have given really modern attention to the improvement of useful trees, but very, very rarely. One example that springs to mind is that people got busy to ennoble the rubber tree. And the noble rubber tree then had a productivity, a high multiple of that of the natural rubber tree. On the whole, you can see in history where people have really looked well after their trees, they have done well. And they have done democratically well. And where they have neglected the trees, they have run into the very type of problems that we are running into now. So I would like to close by saying here, for instance, is a neglected technology, art of doing things, which, however, everybody can take a part in, can make it his business not to pass any length of time without somewhere being instrumental in the establishment of a tree. The tree is a living thing. It requires living beings to look after them. There should be a person-tree relationship. And I remember when India was a country flowing with milk and honey, it was at a time when the Buddha taught that every good Buddhist would establish a tree every 5 years of his life. In this country, you're going to face very big problems of energy supply, but also of water supply, many other supplies. And there is no one single thing that I can think of that would be more helpful and also widen the horizon of people better than if we could get particularly all the town dwellers to get interested in establishing trees. Thank you for your attention.
I think before I introduce the other speakers on the panel, I'd just like to say something from Acorn, since we started out as a seed, so to speak. We really did. I'd like to play on his metaphor just for a moment. I was talking just before I came on stage with Peter Gillingham, the Director of Intermediate Technology's mother. And she said, I think that you become a sage when you realize that there are stages. And I think that whatever we tried to plant with Acorn as just a little newsletter, I don't know how many of you have even seen it, we just started publishing and planting it. It's tough to know when you're growing, that you're growing, or what's growing. And she was telling me that if you're a plant, you do grow, but in the process of growth, it's painful and it's very unclear. And I know as a result of this conference, I still feel very unclear. I know we want a network to grow. We want it to be like a tree. We want it to have, the metaphors are going to get a little mixed, and so I've got to be careful if I talk about fertilizer and the people on the panel. But in a sense, it was a real trip to get to choose the people to put up on this panel, and they were chosen for very specific reasons because I admire all of them greatly, and I think that what they have to say will provide some inputs to the discussion of the day that may not have been put, may have. And I'd like to introduce each of them briefly, and then we'll go about trying to answer the questions that we gathered earlier. The first is Ken Isaacs, who got wrapped up into this networking process by a simple phone call saying, gee, I think I'm small is beautiful too. You want to talk about it? And I'd like him to talk about it just for a few minutes.
To say the least and follow the model that's established, I would just say use less. The technology of restraint in always using less and being more selective in every process. The only thing that I've attempted to do physically in terms of that, it has happened that people have spoken for using less for various reasons for a long time, many years. Part of the problem is that we've never had the hardware to support using less. Less has always meant simply less. And that's why everyone in North America and over the world have become interested in having more. The deep question in architecture, design, the psychological questions, is it really possible to break the chains of hostility and human conflict and not offer the palliation of material activities, but to offer real comfort and a real home of man. So use less, I would say. That's what interests me.
I'm also happy to welcome Carl Scheer, who's an international representative of the United Auto Workers.
Let me stand this up because I can't see from this side. It's quite a great experience to see so many people come out on such a socially responsible subject. And I'd like to throw out some of the ideas based upon what Dr. Schumacher has said that the labor movement faces, that they have to deal with, and they have to take forthright stands. Many sections of the labor movement, because it's a varied movement, it's made up of so many different international unions, have programs that correspond with Dr. Schumacher, but they have to not only give lip service to it, but talk out. Let me just cite a few. That this devastating crisis that Dr. Schumacher talks about is obvious to all of us who've gone through this winter and are facing the problems that society has. We have to develop cooperative forms of enterprise. We have to talk about economic democracy and civic influence on the economic progress and the economic programs. We have to find work for all. It's a thing that's really frightening, the fact that there are people in society that say that we can live with 8% unemployment, 9% unemployment, when that means that the blacks, the minorities, and the women will be the ones that will be out of work and not be able to have an income and be subjected to the status and standards of the new Bureau of Budget, which says that The way you get out of being poor under the January release is to get cancer, and if you get cancer, you get chemotherapy, and if you get chemotherapy and radiation, that makes you middle class because you have to add that money to the welfare payments. And it's a horrible thing that we see. But we have to have work, and that's one of the ways in which this society has to function. The student riots in Italy the last couple of days were based on the fact that the students looking forward to graduation find that there's no work, nothing for them to do. And we have the same thing here, except we haven't rioted yet. There are more PhDs unemployed today, I guess, than many sectors of society, and without any hope for the next period as far as work opportunity in the fields in which they were trained. We have to talk about planned management with a fair distribution of the results of the production. And we have to balance production with the needs and with the points that Dr. Schumacher talked about on humanity, mental and spiritual health. And we have to control the technological development. We have to say progress, yes, but we have to think about the environment. In the last 10 years in the factories, we've become more conscious than ever of the number of people who die and get killed than ever before. The carcinogenics. We all knew about asbestos, but we said it was 25 years in development, but that's false. That's not so. We found where people who have been exposed have died of cancer in 6 months, and we have now the lead problem in the batteries, and we know, now that you saw what happened to the Cincinnati River, you just imagine that there are workers in the shop that have been exposed to carbon tetrachloride and degreasing of piece parts for many years and have suffered because of that. There are hundreds and hundreds of chemicals that are hazardous. And Dr. Schumacher talks about so many scientists. Walter Reuther always had an expression that 90% of all scientists in the history of mankind are alive today. And yes, what are they working on? Are they working on the elimination of the carcinogenics and the hazardous materials? No, they're working on products and stuff that will just add to the complications of our society. We have to have a responsible management of the raw materials and energy, and we have to recognize that there will be an exhaustion of the assets and the natural resources, and undermines the chances for everybody living a good life and having a good external environment. So we have to have planning, but planning is a dirty word in America. Planning, the corporations plan, but if government or society says they're going to plan, that's not right. And we have to talk about the auto prices and the steel prices and manipulative powers of the auto industry and the U.S. Steel. And we can talk about the light bills and natural gas bills and Bell Telephone, because they have become irresponsible in their conduct. We have to have a regional balance and coordinated by national planning on the various matters that society has. So from what Dr. Schumacher has stated tonight, and I say that we have to go and carry that on, and we have to do more, but we have to make planning and understand that we have to plan because there's a limited amount both of the resources that we have and of the production and the opportunity for work. We have to make planning, national planning, an acceptable goal and an acceptable standard in our society. Thank you.
Probably one of the most significant ways that we're going to be able to move immediately on appropriate technology at a national level is through the National Center for Appropriate Technology. And I'd like to introduce again Tony Maggiori.
I'd like to speak briefly on the National Center and then move along so we can have questions, I hope, for Dr. Schumacher. Several years ago, I was selected, among others, to join a planning team to design the National Center for Appropriate Technology. And what happened was that a Dr. Plunkett from the Montana Energy Research and Development Institute, former Senator Mansfield, and a fellow by the name of Dick Saul pulled a group of us together from all over the country, representing both community action agencies and appropriate technologists throughout the country. And we tried to talk. We had difficulty talking. Community action people don't talk the same language that appropriate technologists talk. And it took us 2 years to finally not only communicate, but to develop a plan and a proposal to establish the National Center for Appropriate Technology. We had many issues, many arguments. Should it be national? Isn't that paradoxical to the concept of appropriate technology? Can we create both? If it is a national, how do you actually get a movement going in this country in any significant way and have funding other than private funding to support it? Doesn't the government have a responsibility to do this? We argued for many meetings and many months, and what came out of it is a national center that is located in Butte, Montana, very young, that will attempt to implement two approaches, a centralized and decentralized approach, a strongly decentralized approach. But we're young, we're inexperienced, we're virgins in trying to do this. I say that because in our first few years we're going to make errors. We are very open and very flexible. Our primary purpose, and our ideas, by the way, did develop out of Dr. Schumacher's book. His concept, as well as the concepts of others, molded and became the foundation of the National Center for Appropriate Technology. The primary purpose of the center is to bring together the skills of appropriate technologists and the experiences of community action agencies to focus on problems confronting poor people. So it's tied directly to the issue of poverty. In fact, we have a grants program, and that program can only fund efforts that are tied directly to helping the poor. It's also an attempt to promote AT on a national level and on a local level as well. We will attempt to not only expand our current board, but expand our operations during the months ahead. We hope that part of our product will be a beginning redefinition of relationships on a local and national level as it relates to the area of energy. Redefinition within the context of us as people to our environment and to energy, so that we can not only re-examine the changes that have to be made, but also how people can get involved on local levels in not only focusing on helping each other, but beginning to promote love. And though I hate to use the term love, because it's in the songs and it's in books, and sometimes we become cynical about it. But when I look at this area and I look at the experiences we've had over the past several years in developing this program, and especially in our relationships with poor people, short of having a degree of love between people who are focusing on a specific goal, the end product tends not to be what it could be with that. So I want to say to Dr. Schumacher that his books and his ideas have generated not only interest here, but interest throughout the world, and that at least the National Center, among the other groups in the country, will hope to expand those ideas so that the end product is helping people. And I also want to thank ACORN and the Governor State University for holding this conference in the Midwest. I think that's significant that all of us can get together here. Thank you.
And then finally, words from our mystery guest, Harvey Lyon.
One morning, many years ago, we lifted anchor and sailed out of the harbor of Matanzas, Cuba. But the anchor fouled and came up upside down, resting against the side of the ship like a battering ram. If we went out in the open sea, as the ship swung in the water, the anchor would smash against the prow. If we tried to drop the anchor, we would turn into a pendulum. The whole deck gang went to work to try to solve what we had to do. We could not use rope because the anchor was too heavy. Only one man in the crew was skilled enough to be able to splice wire, because wire has 12 strands. He was a Danish seaman, older than the rest of us, and we all stood in awe of his skill. The skipper came down to watch. When the sling had been prepared, there was the question of putting it in place. The bosun, sixth generation in his family of bosuns, would not even ask one of us to go over. He was, of course, secured with a line, but nonetheless, if he slipped or the line slipped, he would fall into the wake of the ship, not a chance to live. A few minutes later, the anchor righted, dropped down into position, and was pulled up tight. And a week or so later, an accountant in New York made an entry for a variance on direct labor and another entry for a variance on indirect labor. And there was a sufficient blip so that the skipper would have to answer to the controller what happened. I've often thought of that event because that morning, we as a group of men, working quickly, trustingly, lovingly, respecting competencies and the obligations of authority, had handled and solved a problem which threatened us all. And at the same time, there was another aspect to it: cost, control, deviation. What happened? How is it possible to get a society which reflects both of those controls? Not just one, because one is destructive. I would like to present some ideas on that as a, I may say so, a tribute to Dr. Schumacher, whose book has had a profound influence on me and I know on most of you. The ideas are not mine. I wish they were. They're the work of an economist named Jerome Schuchter in a book which he has just finished writing and which is not yet published. A book which represents a lifetime reflection. Let me outline what he has proposed in very simple form in the outline. The book is called Revolutionizing Reform. And he points out that, as we all know, social advance comes hard. Reforms always tend to fall short of their goals because by their very nature, they avoid grappling with the dominant power. Here in his book, he has set up a group of reforms which are designed to have a revolutionary impact, capable of restructuring the United States society to shift power from corporations to people. The reforms structure around two elements. The first, capitalism's peerless productive capability. The second, the new social spirit already widespread in the nation and ready to emerge. The key maneuver, Jerry says, would constrain further growth of the business sector, opening the way for what he calls a socialist sector to take shape outside the profit boundary. Then, while the business sector continued to grind out the nation's product in a highly competitive milieu, its socialist counterpoise would take charge of the public welfare. The constraints on business would be three. First, a ceiling on total business profits, which would arrest further economic growth and which would not be fully responsive to inflation. Second, tax rates on business profits, which would be graduated to favor smaller business firms against larger ones at every level. Third, a continual rollover of capital would be required in foreign ventures so that American corporations which established foreign subsidiaries would, in time, be obliged to sell them at a regulated pace to the nationals of the country in which those businesses were established. The reforms, of course, would work changes in business operations, to be sure, and for this purpose, Jerry proposes the establishment of what he calls a business center, which would be one company, one vote, and which would regulate private industry. The one company, one vote would mean, of course, that small business would have the dominant voice in such a system. Prodded by the graduated tax rates, small business would move to a leading role, and the business sector would be freed of many government restraints. Certain business practices would be judged objectionable when profits are shared from a limited public pool. All of the profit above the fixed limit would flow over into what Jerry calls the socialist sector, into the part of the country which is not served by the business sector and has been harmed by it. Because of its lopsided inheritance, he says, the socialist sector would take a singular shape. It would begin with unemployed and inexperienced workers by the millions, great masses with small skills. Its massive first task would be the eradication of urban blight. Its victims would become its repair crews. Many existing government agencies, he points out, fit readily into the sector. Its powers and initiatives should flow, however, not from inherited leaders or ideologues, but from those actually engaged in the work of social rehabilitation. The mass would seek to transform itself from raw and untutored misfits into workers adeptly engaging society's greatest problems. There would be room for those who wanted to stay in the private sector and those who wanted to go in the socialist sector and those who really didn't care about either one. Because the slums are, after all, the business system's own negligent creation.
An answer session will do is draw together some of the separate trains that have been coming out in this conference. I don't know whether you all feel the frustration that I'm feeling right now, except for that I want to hear some of the perspectives integrated, and I hope that your questions will do it. So I'll address them to the panel, and let's see if we can't now get somewhere with these people who are up there. What we tried to do at the conference was not have a talking heads conference. You know, and I think you got to participate during the day. Let's see what comes out. Yeah, am I in your way?
You can't see it over here. See, they can't see us. We can't see Schumacher.
By the way, I'd like to make two connections while I'm here. Larry Wolf, there's Dave Moberg. Dave Moberg, would you raise your hand? Larry Wolf's over, he's been looking for him all day. This is a resource bank. And no notes, no pens. And also, just before I forget it, tomorrow we are having the network meeting. There will be no lectures, there will be no slides, there will be no media equipment. It will take place in the Art and Architecture building beginning at 10. If you want to come and work on networking activities, come. And I think that'll be a self-selecting group. We hope we don't get 2,200 like we got today. We had planned on getting about 400. And also, after that meeting tomorrow, at 3 o'clock, there will be a ride pool forming to get people out of here, out of state. So if you need a ride, I say, you know, come around to that meeting.
No, this is the one
Okay, to the panel. Suppose a small urban community or neighborhood became self-sufficient for its basic needs, but still exists within the larger socioeconomic system. Will small be politically liberating as well as beautiful? That's a tough question.
Surely any degree of self-sufficiency is liberating, whether it's done on a small basis or a big basis. That's the point. If you're no longer totally dependent for all supplies, but can be self-sufficient to a large degree, then you are free, and you can snap your fingers at the authorities or at the corporations.
Ken?
But the issue underlying much of this is what happens and takes place within each of us as individuals lies behind. That we talk about communities, we talk about planning, and people have been working with large-scale models for a long time now and doing a lot of damage. In a way, my primary responsibility is to cleanse myself. And that will have a reflection in my political group. I must deal with my child well, and don't always do it. But I cannot really operate on these slightly abstract social levels without getting to myself. And that's what each of us must do. You are dependent and you lack liberty as long as you must go to a high-powered specialist when your fly is open.
I think one thing we can say
After that?
is that liberation has to mean example. And anytime you have a positive example, one has tremendous difficulties trying to measure the impact. So as long as any self-sufficiency or any degree of liberation exists, whether it's with an individual or within a group or an institution, and that becomes a very powerful positive example, the impact of that within itself creates other kinds of positive forces, within the universe.
Okay, I'd like to ask another question. What message will you take to President Carter as a result of this trip?
I'm awaiting proposals from the floor.
Really?
Well, I would suggest that you communicate to President Carter that he can begin in this country to institute the collective responsibility game. That too much of whatever we've been dealing with as Americans, we've been dealing with it on the basis of privilege and exploitation. And if we continue to deal with processes that relate to self-annihilation, eventually we will do that. That is, annihilate us. And I do not believe that God will give us again this precious gift of life for us to act like we are children of children and destroy it. Because a child of a child doesn't have any parents. And if you don't have any parents, then you don't have an example. And if you don't have an example, then you lose your way. And obviously we have lost our way. So what you can tell him is that America, because we are so affluent, because we are so powerful in terms of media, in terms of culture, in terms of technology, that we, our government, must become the example. We must set the example for the world so that never again will we lose our way and become, children of children.
Thank you.
I would say that to tell President Carter not to listen to his economic advisor Schultz and an acceptable level of unemployment at 9% and start developing some of these community programs that are so important for the vitality of the country and putting people back to work.
Tony, if you were going to accompany him, why should he invest in it?
Why should he
invest in appropriate technology if you went with Dr. Schumacher to see President Carter?
Well, he's got some facts confronting him that it would appear to me frighten him. Currently in Congress, or in the Senate now, there's a big debate on a $200 million appropriation to have people whose utilities are going to be shut off during the next few weeks. In other words, in effect, during the next few weeks in this country, in excess of 500,000 households, by the way, will get terminated utility service because what is called moratorium, the moratoriums in various states, excuse me, I don't mean households, 500,000 people will have their heat turned off as a result of the end of moratoriums by utility companies throughout most Midwestern states and eastern states. The President's aware of the data. He has to make a decision as to whether or not he's going to do something in this area to help poor people. Because if the Senate passes this bill, and apparently they're going to, a major decision has to be made. That decision cannot be made by him within the context of just poor people not having sufficient resources to pay utility bills. It has to be made by him within a larger context. So it appeared to me that appropriate technology, and it's my understanding his staff are quite interested in, for example, solar water heaters as a cost-effective way, a very fast way of assisting poor people in conserving energy and saving money. So I think the President would be interested if I accompanied him, and But whether or not he's willing to spend the money, it's one thing to have an interest, but it's another thing to make a commitment and to spend money. And I would reserve judgment on President Carter until he's done something. I think when we judge people on the basis of their ideas prematurely, that often expectations are very high and we become very frustrated and very disappointed. And I'm not implying that President Carter is going to disappoint us, but I'm among those who've been disappointed since the 60s. So it takes a lot to make me happy now after the last 15 years. Thank you.
I'd like to try one. Let me move it on a bit. Let me try this with Ken. How do you create a simple living movement with minority and poor people and not just white middle class folks?
My natural dislike of being presumptuous makes me not want to say much on that, but I'm on the spot. My father at one time was a sharecropper on an American farm, so in a way I was a disadvantaged child, and in terms of architectural fees, I've been a disadvantaged adult for years because of the kind of work that I've done. The only thing that understanding in North America, let me apply this just to myself, and I won't answer your question. We have been faced with a very seductive menu. That seduction makes us weak. It makes us not have character. We are very much like spoiled children and very reliant. We will all speak about television, but most of us will go home and watch the late movie to unwind. We will not, this is very priggish to say this, but we're not tough. We lack the dignity of being in direct contact with life. Sometimes you think in terms of the academic world in North America is many lovely people sitting around waiting for the grants to come in. Now, I don't mean to be vicious in saying that. What I just mean to say is that to be a person is to act on the basis of what you find yourself with, not what you can find from some outside agency. President, you think so? It's at this time in our nation's history, what a rotten thing to say. But we do have a background of this. What would we do if it were the atomic bomb and doomsday, but we were preserved? We could not look to Carter or some Kennedy-esque dream of excellence. We just look to ourselves, and it would be this I have, and this pen, and we would have to make life and have children and go on and make thoughts and make what we call beauty. It's just us. There isn't anything else here. We have to do it. No grants, no nothing. That's what I think.
But it's tough with no grants. I can tell you. One of the reasons that this conference came off the way it did was because we applied for a grant. And we got it February 26th, which left us not much time.
I think on the question of mobilizing the poor and the minority, it's a subject that's been on the minds of so many people as to this is the way to do it because the squeaking joint gets the grease. But it's difficult to mobilize. You have a section of the population which is cynical, which feels there's no hope. And so in order to organize effectively, they have to have self-confidence, and they just don't. Now, we had that in the civil rights movement in the 60s, and it was mobilized, and masses were mobilized, and the March on Washington was a fantastic thing. What you have to do is have a program that has, in the minds of the poor and the minorities, a chance to succeed And that kind of realization will give them the self-confidence to build an organization. It's the most difficult thing. At this time, there ought to be, and it would be natural that there should be, whole sections of the poor organized and the minorities organized, because there's a crying need for it. But it's not it's not that easy to carry it off as to just say that there ought to be it.
I think probably the most difficult thing in terms of trying to mobilize poor people or minority people or underclass people in this society is the awesome fact that the value constructs out of which we operate probably will not allow us to do it. And middle class people, secondly, are not willing to give up anything. We're not willing to change our lifestyles at any level or to any degree to help somebody that's poor. Now, my friend was saying that he does not want to deal with the concept love. Well, I can deal with that. I can deal with love because love is collective responsibility. It's about how you build life, not how you destroy life. And we've been so bent on destroying life that we have not learned how to build life. And so if we started out with nothing, this pen and this paper, we probably would perish, most of us, because we do not know anything about ourselves. And unless one is in touch with himself, you can't be in touch with the universe, you can't be in touch with God, because you're continually trying to be something that you are not, rather than being what you are. And what we are men. And most of us do not want to be men, we want to be gods. And the only problem is that you can't be a god, you must be a man. If you want to be a god, then the only god you can be is God over your own life. Problem is, most folk don't want to be gods over their own lives, they want to be God over somebody else's so they can exploit you.
There's an unidentified woman in the audience who I'm not going to say who it is, but she's profoundly influenced my thinking about all this. She keeps calling herself the lady in the nylon pantsuit, and you know, every time I come up, I always go to her because she's a very excellent writer, and she takes what I write and makes it, you know, intelligible. And we were talking the other day about this conference and about her husband and her life, and she said, you know, I think that Dr. Schumacher probably won't have anything or won't have the opportunity to say anything to me because I paint my fingernails red and I wear these nylon pantsuits, and my husband is a skilled meat cutter, and I had no idea how much skill there was in cutting a side of beef. You know, I don't know whether any of you are familiar with cutting sides of beef, but and you know, so I started to think, okay, is this lower income? Is this the poor people we're talking about? She said, no. He makes about $12,000 a year, but he's not going to come to your conference. And so I asked her why, and she said, well, you know, he doesn't have time to think about a concept of self. You know, he goes in there and he's working in a job where he's not in the union, and he's working for a guy who he doesn't respect, and his skill is not respected, and he's not here. And I don't think very many of you out there are meat cutters or are that audience, which is really the audience I think Tony's talking about addressing. It's not poverty. You know, people here don't, if you're going to have people identifying with a movement, they're not going to identify themselves the way that we're talking about it, I don't think. I mean, people here don't like to call themselves poor people or poverty. Everybody's in the middle class or the lower middle class. And that's why this question intrigues me, because maybe simple living isn't the word, but how do you create it's an identity question. It's really, Harvey, you want to try addressing that?
In Harvey Lyon's study of James Joyce, he speaks of Bloom, following Bloom through the day. That what you learn is that Bloom is a common man, and that the common man is not so common after all. I think that's really the basic gamble of democracy. It's one that means that you have to be willing to accept plastic seat covers and the hair rollers in the supermarket and a whole bunch of other things that we all know are horrible. And I think that if you believe that people can run their own lives, then you really have to believe it. Not that they can run their own lives if only they come to our school and get taught what we think they ought to know, and come to conferences we think they ought to come to, and buy the kind of lamp to put in the front window of their little bungalow that we think is not offensive. If you're going to disperse power in a society, you have to bet finally on the wisdom, the good sense, decency, as well as on the vulgarity and the violence, the barbarism of common people. How does one do that in a society such as this one? It seems to me, those who were at the seminar that I was in this afternoon will now hear something a little more familiar. What we talked about this afternoon was very different. It seems to me that in a society that's marked by high concentration of private property, such that 1% of the households in the United States own 53% of all of the corporate securities, and 10% own almost all the rest, that dispersing economic power, economic freedom, by various techniques of the dispersal of private property, including the Commonwealth idea of the Scott-Batter Commonwealth, which Dr. Schumacher is a director and one of the formulators, of the various companies in the ICOM movement in England, of the utilization of employee stock ownership trusts, stock bonus trusts, and other such devices in this country, provides a means by which people can be given a chance to run their own lives. And we all have to gamble that if they are given that chance, they will do it well. I think they will.
Could we hear this question again? Could you read it out again?
Well, I made it up. It was, how do you create a simple living movement with minority and poor people? And I don't like to phrase it that way. I'd rather say whatever that group is that's not here and would not be attracted to the concepts.
Well, why on earth should anyone want to create a movement among poor people of simple living? They are forced into simple living. No, what is interesting is that in this country there is now a widespread movement among the relatively well-off middle class of voluntary simplicity. Now that means something. It's not a matter of creating it among the poor because they're in that position already. But if the middle classes see the point of changing their lifestyle, then something can really happen. But I always think there's something wrong with questions, how do you influence other people? I don't like these questions. I think we ought to ask questions like, what should I be doing and how should I get organized, etc., etc. Not how do you influence other people. That doesn't make sense to me.
Except how come everybody out there keeps asking how? Really, how-tos are the most popular selling books, according to Advertising Age. Just for kicks.
I'd like to...
I would like to ask another question of Dr. Schumacher. Please comment on the problem of land costs and land speculation as obstacles to decentralization, and the promise of community land trusts and any other models for getting access to land.
I have already been advised to advise the President not to trust his economic advisors, which I'm sure is good advice. For one thing, because the economists talk about 3 factors of production, as if they were all much of a muchness, namely labor, which means people. To treat people as factors of production is already a bit far-fetched. Land and capital. Of these 3, only capital is man-made and can be pushed around. land certainly is not man-made, and as long as land is an object of speculation or speculative investment, none of these problems can be solved. I'm quite certain of this. The real question is, what can we do about it? So far, the world is full of proposals to leave it totally in private hands, then it remains an object of speculation, or to nationalize it or socialize it in some other way. Well, these are words which frighten some people or enchant some people, but let's look behind the word. Nationalization is that land should be administered by a bureaucracy. Now, this bureaucracy is unlikely, or is likely to suffer from the lack of dignity that results from not being in touch with real life. This is, to me, quite unthinkable, that land should be bureaucratically controlled. So we have to find some sort of middle way. I myself in Britain have made a proposal which hasn't attracted the slightest attention. Namely, that we should establish, as of a given date, the value of each individually held parcel of land. This can be done. Technically, this can be done. There's no great difficulty about it. So that each bit of land has a value. This should be the registered value of this land. By all means, in times of inflation, you can index it so that it's inflation-proof. And if the owner wants to sell it, that's all he can get for it. So it is removed from the possibility of speculation. If there are buyers that are prepared for one reason or another to pay very much more, the difference of between what the buyer pays and the owner gets should go into a public fund. Now, I can't debate this now, but something along these lines, with a clear objective, it must be taken out of speculation. Once it's out of speculation, these horrendous price movements won't happen anymore. We need that. The whole of southern England is now being bought by Arabs, Germans, French, Belgians, because the pound is so cheap. Well, I mean, all this is absolutely crazy. That would be my answer to this question. In community land trust, all this is a good beginning, because the trust may be trustworthy and certainly doesn't intend to speculate with the land. The main curse on the land is speculation.
Would you try one more? Why do you believe Buddhist economics will work in the West?
Oh, well, the West is just as much capable of common sense as anybody else. It's got to work. We've got to come to something more rational than what we've got now. And if we don't do it deliberately, it'll be forced upon us through the facts of the universe. We can't go on building buildings like this. I'm delighted with the applause from the architect. He can tell us more about it. But to get into a phase where you carefully exclude all natural light and air, and to have so many of these buildings at a point when we are moving into a more and more insistent energy shortage. This is quite a thing. So we'll have to adopt quite different principles in our thinking, namely that there is no virtue, no value in maximizing consumption. You want to maximize satisfactions, and you want to get your satisfactions with a minimum of consumption to still get them. Now, this is what the voluntary simplicity movement in this country are beginning to discover. They're not dour-faced Puritans. On the contrary, they say, God, I'm all burdened with all this clutter. In order to maintain this clutter, I have to make a big income. So I'm in the rat race. If I get rid of the clutter, I can get out of the rat race. And I can have a job, a modest job, which is enough to keep me going. And I'm a free person compared with what I was before. There's an excellent group in California whom I encountered, a group of Quakers who perhaps a bit sardonically call themselves the Earthquakers. But anyway, They want to get back to the earth. Of course, they're middle class, but they go around to their friends, Quaker friends, and say, well, you're now 55. Are you looking forward to your retirement? Yes, I'm looking forward to my retirement. What do you want to do when you're retired? Oh, well, then I'll dig my garden and do this and that. And then they say, why don't you do it now? What are you waiting for? And this comes as quite a shock. You know? They'd never thought about it. They say, yes, actually, I can do it now, you see. And they rid themselves of all this clutter and find that they can, even at 55, retire, of course, with a very much smaller pension, or perhaps no pension at all, but they'll survive. Now, this is an interesting movement. This is a reorientation towards what I call Buddhist economics. I mean, I might have called it Christian economics, but then no one would have read it.
That's the question that I wanted to raise, essentially. Since most of the problems that we experience tend to relate to human values and the kinds of problems that stem from the fact that we have not been developing values in terms of long-term perspectives, nor have we been about character building in ourselves and our children, you know, etc. What is it that Christianity, since Christianity obviously is a religion that has been controlled historically in terms of sources by whites, what is it that Christianity has to say in terms of the current ecological kinds of problems, in terms of environmental quality that we experience? Can it say anything? Does it have anything to say? Since essentially the problem is a problem of human values. Now come, white folk. I mean, you must. I mean, we do deal with religion sometimes. I hope.
Would somebody like to throw up a couple of questions from the audience? I don't like the questions that I have.
They want you to answer.
Now we understand what Dr. Schumacher meant by nobody would have read the book.
There's some terrible statements in the New Testament. One, for instance, that which you have done to the least of them, you have done to me, Jesus speaking. Or that which you have not done, you have not done to me. Well, that establishes on every Christian a tremendous duty to concern himself with the least of his brethren. There's also another statement, namely that relates to all the talents that have been distributed. Some have more talents and some less. But those, that one unfortunate fellow who thought, well, I'd better bury it so when it's demanded back from me, I still have it, he is sent into the outer darkness. Which means that we are obliged to use our talents. We are not allowed to exploit them, but have to develop them, and develop them, of course, for the community. There's another story about the chap who hires workmen. Well, those who have been available for work but were not hired and only work the last hour of the day, they get the same pay as those who've been working all day. Now, this also gives us a very good line. I'm not suggesting this should be labor union policy, but that when people are ready to do something and are not being used, they have done what they can do. So all these things, when you read them with really open eyes, have very far-reaching implications for our economic life, although they're not couched in economic terms.
Which one? Me? Yeah, Dr. Schumacher. Okay. I was in a conference today, and we were talking about decentralizing technology and appropriate technology and winding some, industrial well, I don't want to say military, winding some industrial complexes down, slowing things down some. And somebody there brought up the point that if we decentralize our technology and like give up some of the really, you know, the intense potential for research and development and certain kinds of intense productivity that our present concentrated technology gives us, we will lose a place, we will lose a certain place that we have in the world. We will not be able to, I don't know what this person was meaning exactly, but it said that we won't be able to compete economically in the world today, and the United States will become weakened. Like, we've talked here a lot tonight about like what will happen in a country if it slows down some complexes and some intensities. But some people say
Could we have your question?
Yeah, okay, some people say that they're worried, I'm sorry, it's a little difficult. They're worried that it will, you know, interfere with our ability to economically compete in the world and will end up hurting like any country that decides to decentralize itself. How about that?
Did you get that back there? Okay.
Well, that's a bit hard to say. The question was, if we wind down the industrial complexes, shall we as a country still have enough research potential and so on? It's not a question, if I may say so, that appeals to me very much, because I can't see in this audience anyone who's able to wind down the industrial complex. So what are we talking about? Purely fantasy. What we are ought to be talking about is something quite different. There are in the Western world 15 million unemployed. They don't give strength to the Western world, they give weakness to the Western world. And an appropriate technology would be able to help to reabsorb them into the mainstream. There are movements in the Western world of a concentration of population, vast congestion in some places, enormous emptiness in another place. This is not strengthening the Western world, but weakening it. So we want a technology that fits into the neglected regions so that there can be a more healthy distribution of the population, etc., etc. There are tensions in our countries between very rich and very poor, and poverty of a kind which is not blessed, which is misery, which is degrading. This is particularly striking to any European who visits the United States. There is a country with an income per head twice that of Western Europe, and you find a degrading kind of poverty which you don't find in Western Europe, except very rarely. Now, this doesn't make the country strong, it makes it weak. So we want a technology that these gaps can be closed, or at least to some extent ameliorated. So, not to worry. No, there's no one who can wind down the industrial military complex. Unfortunately, if we could, we would.
Thank you.
Scott?
Just a quick question. Did you have a good time at the conference today?
I always have a good time, yes.
Yes. If we could assume that capital-intensive technology is profitable, how do we, as people who may not be benefiting from the profit system, influence those who are benefiting from the profit system to get into more labor-intensive, because it's going to cost them money to do that? Why would they do that?
Well, precisely because they're not doing it, therefore you are doing it. Why talk about other people? This is the appropriate technology movement are people who are now doing it. They are developing a technology so that they can stand on their own feet and that they can make modest profits, that they are viable. They have a very good chance because the super duper monster technology grew up at a time when energy was cheap and plentiful. It will not fit very well when energy is scarce and not and very dear. It depends on long-distance transport, like this example from the baking industry I've given. Long-distance transport will be more expensive, even more and more expensive. So the local producer will have an advantage in future, which he didn't have in the past. And if collectively we create organizations like the National Center, that we put intelligence into the development of small-scale simplified technology, then of course we can create viability, and we might even get the help of the big corporations in doing so. But we go ahead whether we get that help or not.
Oh, I guess I have to go to the other side. Back there in the blue shirt, standing up.
If we do not wind down our technology, is there not some danger of provoking an adverse reaction in the third world, feeling that we are defining appropriate technology for them as intermediate technology and not for ourselves? And in connection with that, the agricultural specialist that spoke this morning took pride in the fact that our agro-business technology is very productive, even though and labor-saving, where I don't feel it's labor-saving if you invest all the labor of building agricultural machinery, fertilizers, and so forth and so on in our production. And I think it points it up that this is defined as something we should not wind down, and doesn't that provoke an adverse reaction in the third world?
Well, let's get this clear when I say I don't want to talk about winding down the industrial military complex. It's simply because I can't see anyone who can do it. And why talk about things we can't do? I'm not saying it wouldn't be desirable. If I knew if anyone could do it, please do it right away. Don't waste any time. It is quite true that the example of the West is not the right model for the third world. That is what I've been concerned with for a couple of decades. And it cannot be assumed that if they imitate us, they will succeed, because the facts speak against that. They will utterly ruin themselves. So the danger exists that we give the wrong example, and I've for long felt that economics cannot be sensibly discussed without the terms temptation and seduction. You know, the economists recoin all these words and they call it free consumer's choice. You know? But that misses the point. It is very easy to tempt poor people with glittering things, but they won't do them any good. Of course, as long as we have that, there is a credibility gap. But now that the rich countries are growing wise to the idea of waking up to the idea of an appropriate technology, and we may be practicing some of these things in their own countries, then at long last we can tell the poor, the third world countries, look, look at this carefully, this may be good for you. Actually, we are also doing it ourselves. That will be better than what it was in the past, when we had to say, that may be good for you, but don't expect us to do it.
Idea of the widest possible distribution of power and property have much effect on people?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Did the English distributists' idea of the widest possible distribution of power and property have much influence on your thinking? I wrote it out, if you could have read it.
Yeah. Well, I discovered them, I think, afterwards, because my thinking was most influenced by Gandhi. But there are certainly, what's the word, soul brothers of mine.
In your book, you speak about the need for people to use local materials to meet local needs. Would you comment on the role, if any at all, that exports can play in the development of a region?
The experts?
Exports.
The question is, what is the role of exports in the development of a region? Well, one thing is quite clear, that if you can have small loops, relatively local production from local materials for local use, you have some solid strength. You are not so vulnerable. And also, of course, you economize very greatly on transport. Now that is the beauty of relatively high local self-sufficiency. Relative, everything is relative. Now the idolatry of exports and imports is really a hangover of colonialism. There we said, here this colony, well, it's of value to the metropolitan country only if there are some valuable exports coming from that country. In Tanzania, we are not interested in, or Tanganyika it used to be called, not interested in the country, or let alone the people. We're interested in getting sisal. From Rhodesia, or what is now Zambia, we want copper. So the only things that seemed to be really worth having were the exports. Well, that is a hangover of imperialism. Exports are different from other trade, only that they cross frontiers. What's particular value of crossing frontiers? No value. What value is there in producing for people you don't even know, and whose language you don't even know? No value in that, as such. This is an idolatry. Now, if, of course, someone far away has something that I want to buy, because bananas in hothouses in England is not very effective, so I want to buy bananas, then I'm interested in buying in imports I'm interested in. Then I have to find the means of payment, and that is the only function of exports. And whether you take this internationally or if you take it in terms of a region or a state of the United States, there's no value, no specific value in sending your goods far afield. It's much more sensible to have local production from local materials for local use as far as this is possible.
Dr. Schumacher mentioned briefly the importance of trees in the health of a civilization. We're operating under the illusion in the Midwest that we're very wealthy because we extract large crops from our topsoil. I would be interested in hearing a little bit about enclosure in Britain, the importance of hedgerows in the health of topsoil and a civilization as a whole.
Our friend wants to hear about hedges in Britain, enclosures, microclimate. Well, all I can say is that our government, like many other governments, has paid a lot of subsidies to enable farmers to pull up the hedges so that they would have bigger fields for bigger equipment. Now we almost get, in some parts we get dust storms that you are familiar with. And I'm quite sure soon the government will give subsidies for replanting hedges and encouraging farmers to use smaller equipment. The thing that worries me is that meanwhile the smaller equipment has gone out of production. But I don't think I can go into a learned disquisition on the microclimate, which is a very important matter, particularly for intensive horticulture.
I think we have to limit questions. It's been a long day for Dr. Schumacher. I'd like to have one more. How about world futures back there?
I'd like to ask Dr. Schumacher, what can we common people and poor people and middle-class people do to increase the chances for participatory democracy? Or more participatory, at least?
How the chances and possibilities of participatory democracy can be increased? Well, surely by all the things we've been talking about. By becoming conscious of the fact that the most precious asset of society, namely its intelligence, has hitherto been used primarily for developments which are not relevant to the real needs of the majority of the people. Something may percolate to them, nobody doubts that, but they are not directly attacked. These needs are not directly attacked. The intelligence is used in this wayward way, as I said, stunt technology. Now, if we become conscious of this, if we establish some process of technology assessment, if we ask the right questions, as is happening in quite a few respects already, then this is already a form of participation. Then we might bend technological development to some extent so that it really helps the ordinary people and not makes the powerful more powerful and more exclusive. That is the only way that I can see. Of course, on another level, the answer is organize, cooperate. You can always find like-minded people. Many people ask me questions, how can we get over onto organic agriculture? I am only a little person. I have no influence. What can I do? I say, are you a member of the Soil Association? That is the organization for organic agriculture in Britain. They say, no, I'm not a member. And it never occurred to me. Well, the pioneers are already at work. So all I can say is participatory democracy means that every one of us make up their own little mind, what do we really think? Which means what do we applaud and what do we detest? We're very muddled on that. The second thing is, once we're clear in our own little minds, then we look around for the pioneers who are already doing the right thing and join them. Join them. It doesn't cost much. $2. And when we have joined them, then we very soon find out what work we could do, with what work we could actually help. So number 3 is then we start work. Real work. Not conferences, but real work.